Welcome to another episode of Through the Glass. Today I'm excited to have Dan Jacobson, the founder and publisher of the TriCity News newspaper. What's up, Dan?
Well, same as it's been for 22 years, putting out this wacky weekly newspaper.
Let's talk about it. I don't know anybody who started a newspaper other than when I was starting in music. There was a lot of kids who would run zines, as they were known, and maybe still are known. What was your entree into publishing your own newspaper?
Well, I have a background in law and politics and journalism, the three of them, and they all combined to allow me to start this newspaper, which I started in 1999 when I was about my late 30s. But before that, in my 20s, I'd been an elected official, a councilman in nearby Ocean Township, a state assemblyman, a legislator in Trenton. Before I went to law school, also in my 20s, I was a reporter at a daily newspaper up in Shrewsbury that now doesn't exist, so I did the reporting there.
What was that called?
It's called the Daily Register. It's gone for about 30, 20 years now. But I did that for a year before law school, so all this stuff mixed together, and I was practicing law in my 30s, and I didn't want to practice law forever, but aside from the political stuff, I always wanted to have a newspaper. I thought it would be great. And the technology in the late 90s, 1998, 1999, was just at the point where you could really start one with really low overhead. And that's what I did. For example, digital photography had just started. Before, if you had a newspaper, you actually had to either have your own dark room or send the photos out to be developed and bring them back.
That's expensive as hell.
It's expensive. It's time consuming. I still have my law practice to do. So, digital photography just came on. Email was coming on finally then. So we had the technology where you could start it on a very low budget, which I did. And it worked well. It took off. It paid for itself and got better and better to the point where I could get out of law several years later and do this full time. And I think it's had a great impact. It's been a hell of a ride. And it's an interesting thing.
I've been reading the paper for years and years. One of the things I like about the paper is it covers such a wide spectrum. So I often will gravitate maybe towards what's going on in the arts and culture. However, I love the political stuff, whether I agree with it or not. And it seems like you made a specific point to point out different points of view politically.
Absolutely.
This side and the other side. And I like how you gave voice or continue to give voice to both of those sides because as you know, so much media and so much everything is not it's just tunnel vision. Echo chamber, tunnel vision. And I always like that about your paper, even if an article would make me fired up and pissed off because of how much I disagreed with it, either politically or just even the tone. I liked that you did that. Was that a conscious decision, and how come we don't see so much of that?
Well, it was a completely conscious decision, and it was rooted in a lot of things that I had paid attention to in my earlier years. I was always interested in history and politics and journalism and everything, even as a teenager. But, I always loved alternative newspapers. I went to school out in UC Berkeley. There was a great paper out there called the Bay Guardian that I think is only online now. Of course, there was the Village Voice. Simultaneously, I love reading the Wall Street Journal because even they had I don't always agree with it, but they have a very well-written editorial page. Whether you agree with it or not, the writing is excellent. And so, before I started the paper, I subscribed to about 40 or 50 alternative newspapers from around the country, all different sizes, all different places, all different styles. They were coming to my house. 50 papers a week were coming. I was ripping through them, just absorbing everything and loving it. Simultaneously, I'm reading the New York Times and the Wall Street Journal cover to cover every day. I'm just absorbing a lot of stuff. I've read a lot of histories and biographies of all different publishers and editors, including now forgotten ones who are regional forces, anywhere in the past century before. And I'd known a lot about this stuff anyway, so I had a lot of things in my head that to think about. And what I did with this thing is, because I have my own law practice, I decided, you know what, I'm going to start a newspaper. And I'm going to start it exactly as I want to do it, because you could do it fairly cheaply then. I still have my law practice. I said, if it doesn't work, it doesn't work. But my belief was excellent content will lead to excellent circulation, which will lead to enough advertising to support and pay the bills and do our job. So as a result, you see all different influences in the newspaper. Back in 1999, in a suburban area like ours, it was certainly unusual to have a LGBT columnist like we did from the start. I always wanted it. It's called the Rainbow Room.
Sure.
We always had a conservative columnist. Now, listen, I didn't anticipate, well, in some ways, I knew it could always happen in our country. I didn't anticipate back 20 years ago the rise of Donald Trump, which I am not, I have a big problem with. But, the conservative columnist, of course, is Ernesto Che Colari, I call him, in a takeoff on Ernesto Che Guevara, which is its own humorous comparison. But Ernesto,
check your political history.
Yeah,
folks,
but Ernesto, Ernesto started becoming more and more pro-Trump. I didn't like it, but what are you going to do? It's part of what has to be heard. And then, of course, we always had the LGBT column. We had a series of liberal columnists. I've transitioned that into a series of voices from the black community, which I think I always wanted, and I did it now after the Black Lives Matter movement, because I was woken up also to things that I had to do differently. So we have these various voices in one place, which, as you pointed out, is unusual today. And that's a problem, because everyone is retreated to their silos. Everyone is hearing what they want to hear. Everyone is building on the misinformation they get. And you know what? To me, they're all the same. I can't watch Fox. I can't watch MSNBC. I can't watch any of them. I understand what they're up to. I understand all their biases. I understand how they play to their audiences. Even the tone of how they talk is specific to their audiences. So if you're someone who loves Fox News, you love the way they talk and you can't stand the way MSNBC sounds. If you're someone who loves MSNBC, you love the way the commentators talk and you can't stand the way the Fox commentators sound. It's a bunch of BS, and it's all for money. It's all for ratings, and it's really a disgrace. So if this little newspaper, as much as it gets people upset at times, we're one of the few places I've seen where we preserve the ability to have these diverse voices in one place. I hear a lot of people, Ernesto's a perfect example. I have a lot of conservative people actually, I love the column. And that's great. So they also get exposed to the other voices. They get exposed to when I sometimes used to rip into Trump, and they have to listen to it. Conversely, those more on the left, have to see what the conservatives are saying. They have to face what the Trump people are saying. And I would tell them, listen, not to annoy you, because listen, I don't like hearing it either, but just to understand how to deal with it, just to understand how to combat it, just to understand how to diffuse it. You got to hear what they're saying.
Wasn't that just a life skill?
Absolutely.
It's unfortunately, a lot of people haven't. I don't think they've developed.
Well, it's not only developing. What's happening is, and again, I guess I'm sure that it's happened in every empire. I'm sure there was analogies and parallels back in the Roman Empire. But we are dividing ourselves, and we are dividing ourselves into our own little corners, and so the communication is stopping. The middle is cratering, the political middle, which is always devastating in democracy. And you have the rise of extremism, which is classic, and the rise of craziness fueling extremism, which is classic, and it's a very bad cycle. And, not to get too off topic, but going back in history, the one time where we avoided it here in this country, I know history pretty well. In the 1930s, Franklin Roosevelt, the reason he was one of the greatest presidents in the country is he took office in the Depression, where things could have spun out of control. In Europe, fascism was on the rise. It looked successful. Hitler and Mussolini were victorious. They turned their countries around that were prostrate on the ground. And all of a sudden, Roosevelt comes in on this fragile democracy and manages to hold it together. And he really saved us. I'm hoping, and commentators talk about it, I'm hoping Biden fills a similar role. Let's hope. Because the whole idea is to somehow preserve some semblance of a political center. And I'm doing it, I guess, in my own little way with this paper, along with the mission we have locally in terms of elevating the arts, elevating the creative, elevating the alternative, making this a suburban area unlike any other. Places happening as any vibrant urban area here on a beautiful coastline. A place where those of us who might have easily moved away to cities, if we grew up here, we've been able to stay here now. Young kids in their teens and 20s who normally would have left to have a creative bent can stay here now. And I think we've developed a beautiful, wonderful place to live. So simultaneously, that's also been the mission of the paper. And I feel we've made great strides in doing that.
It's interesting you mentioned the parallels between the 30s and all that. And the one difference, I suppose, which worries me is, then there was also a strong, as it was known then, I know this term has been transformed a bit and bastardized, but there was a strong populist movement in the country during that time too, in the middle of the country, in the South, with farmers. And I think Roosevelt was also able to sort of gather the energy from that movement, which I think could have been a true middle movement. And it seems like that term definitely has a negative connotation.
Well, it depends. I think that, in history, it's always repeats and there's always differences. So the general similarities, and when the financial crisis hit in 2008 And in 2009, and right after that, there was the rise of Occupy Wall Street, and there was the rise of the Tea Party. And I remember saying, this has the uncomfortable whiff of the 1930s, particularly in Europe, and later on, even more recently with Charlottesville and the street fighting on the right and the left. That is like what happened in Europe before the fascists took over. It almost happened in France, it happened in Germany, it happened in Italy. And what happens, there's populist movements, which are usually often a response to real gripes of people who are mad at the elites who failed. And that happened in the 30s, it's happened today.
Regardless of party.
And so you have all different types of people going for someone who makes promises, who's can communicate with them, who elites often look at as buffoons. And I'm thinking Trump, and I'm not saying Donald Trump is Adolf Hitler. I don't want this. This is recorded. I don't want anyone saying I'm saying he's Adolf Hitler.
That's ridiculous.
But I'm
anyway.
saying but I'm saying is that the analogy is that people who don't understand why Trump can appeal to his supporters don't understand that he speaks to them because he is one of them, and they feel they've been trampled on by the left, by the elite, by the mainstream media. And I think a lot of what he says is ridiculous, and sometimes regular people I think say ridiculous things as they think I do, but to understand his appeal, he is one of them, although a successful reality television star. But I've talked to a lot of people in politics, some who have a lot of money, some who don't have a lot of money, some who do not have a lot of money, and they often sound like him, and they love him because he's like them. Again, not saying he's Adolf Hitler, but the analogy into where a democracy fails is when it came to Hitler. They thought he was a buffoon. You look at the movies, he looks like a buffoon. But I guarantee you back then, there were a lot of people in Germany, which was different than today. It was a traumatized nation that had just lost a war. You had a movement that unfortunately has some parallels here with the big lie. Here it was about the election was stolen back then. There are elements in Germany who said, World War I, we would have won, but the Jews and the socialists stabbed us in the back, and now we have this horrible Treaty of Versailles that's destroying us economically and making us starve, and they point the finger at everybody else, and that was the big lie back then that Hitler rose on. And here was this guy who looks like a joke to us, but there was a lot of people in Germany who were like him and thought like him, and he sounded like they sounded. And again, I want to stress, I'm not saying Trump and Hitler are the same. They're not. But what's similar in a dangerous situation is that today we have social media, which is allowing all different types of misinformation, propaganda to go all over the place in a way that radicalizes both sides, by the way, not just the right, but also the left. And you're stuck in your phone, you're stuck in your social media hole. You're believing everything that you want to believe. You're either some people go to the extreme left, the extreme right. Back in the 30s, the new thing was radio, and suddenly you had this electrifying voice in your home. In Germany, it was Adolf Hitler, and of course that was completely new. Just like now you have Twitter, where the leader speaks to you, and it electrified them. Fortunately, here Franklin Roosevelt was just as good in the medium. And so he also electrified the country that way. So a lot of times the communications in any era also determines the politics of that era in the course. And that was the case in the 30s, and we all know that's certainly the case today.
The medium is the message.
Well, the medium is the message, but the medium, how the leaders communicate is going to determine how they're going to do, who's going to be effective, how they can move people. And my theory is when there's powerful new communications mediums, radio, television, social media, there could be powerful responses if there's a stress on the system. So there are uncomfortable parallels to the 30s. We are not Nazi Germany. Adolf Hitler is not Donald Trump. But in our own way, we are at an unprecedented, dangerous situation because, forgetting Trump for a second, I don't like the extremes on the right or the left, to be honest with you. I think they're problematic, and I think that they're uncompromising. And if you're going to live in a democracy, you have to learn how to compromise, and that's why we always had a successful country before. And they're going to drive us into the ditch if this doesn't stop. And it takes a Rooseveltian leader to do it. And I don't care if he comes from the right or the left. Right now, I can't stomach Republicans because of just what I saw with Trump. But if a Republican can do it down the road, God bless him or her. I'd be happy to see it. But whoever can do it and can preserve that center, that's the key.
Well, I think people should have gotten hip to the fact that both party systems have generally sold out their constituents, and they're pretty much keeping their own machine going and supporting the corporations that support them. And I'm not sure if either has has trickled that down or passed that off. I mean, sure, there are some social differences.
Like, I think people get distracted by the idea of corporate power. There's undeniably corporate power in the system, but you have to understand. And I was deeply involved in my 20s, and in the state legislature, I saw what happened, and I knew anyway. Politicians, because we put so much, I don't know what the word is I'm looking for, so much prominence. It's so, it's such a big deal to be. It's such a prestigious position, and we really shouldn't give it that much prestige. It really should be less prestige because people love it. It's such a great ego trip for people. It's like you're a leader and you looked up to, and it's an unusual personality that wants to do that. Some are great, some are assholes. So they want to be in office, much more than people realize, because particularly at the federal level, Congress, Senate, governors, I compare them to Major League Baseball. They are the best at their game. They are the best actors. They are the best manipulators. And I've seen them. I start out with them. Someone up there. Some are very nice people, but people get led by these people in our system as well as other systems, and they know how to lead people, to manipulate them to believe that they believe what they believe in. And and people get trapped in all of a sudden following people who are telling them everything they agree with. And if you stopped and thought, someone's telling me everything I agree with, is it really possible that that's what they believe? And am I always right? But that's the way it works. That's human nature. So what happens is that in our political system, it's not just where the corporations go, it's where, for us, it's where the votes go, it's where the power goes. So labor has a lot of power. Public employee unions have a tremendous amount of power. Corporations have a lot of power. Various special interests have a lot of power, whether it's trial lawyers or doctors or insurance companies. And as I always like to say, when people bemoan that, when I ask them enough questions, all of them are represented by one of these special interest groups. So the problem is us. There's almost every person who is complaining is represented somehow by a special interest group, somehow. Or they're considered a valuable constituency of some party. And in the end, a democracy is supposed to sort all that out, find some compromise between everybody, affect some type of policy that has a broad good, and we're supposed to move on in peace and not chaos. But what's happened here is obviously there's a lot of strains. It's hard to lead. Everyone's trying to rip you down. And with the technology, now we're divided even more. So yeah, I think it's a grim time. I think it's a really grim time, as grim as the 30s here. So hopefully you get a leader who can transcend it. And one more thing I want to make a point about with Trump. One of the things I like to say to Trump supporters, and of course, listen, I don't personally, I like Biden. I think he's a decent guy. I don't see why people don't like the guy. He's a decent guy. You can disagree with him on some stuff. The Bernie Sanders group, I salute them. I like them. I like their idealism. I don't think it's always so practical what they're talking about, because they don't really give practical ways that a lot of it's going to be put in place. But that's okay. But their heart's in the right place. Bernie, I don't like. I think he's very divisive. I think he really also is incredibly divisive, rips people apart. So I say that because what I love to, there's two things I love to say to Trump people, and they actually listen. I'll say, listen. I would say to them, look, did you like Ronald Reagan? I loved Ronald Reagan. He was terrific. I said, well, what your guy is doing, Ronald Reagan would never do. Ronald Reagan never ripped people apart. And I didn't like Ronald Reagan at the time. I was very liberal in the 80s when I was in my 20s. I said Ronald Reagan reached out to the center, won landslide victories. He had mainstream media against him. The liberals hated him. He had no Fox News. He had no Twitter. And he scored tremendous victories because he did what any president in a democracy like ours is supposed to do. He unites people. He doesn't just go to his base and play to them and rile them up because he loves the adulation and rips us apart. He preserves the system by forging a coalition, and he had a lot more against them than Trump ever got against him than you think Trump has against him with supposedly a mainstream media. Fox News is the most powerful media outlet in the world. He had Twitter. So Trump had plenty of ammunition to defend himself. Reagan managed to have 2 landslide victories that he won. And I always point out that because what Trump is doing, it's the classic anti-democratic move, because he just plays to his base and he riles up his base and he has a feedback loop with his base. He gives everybody else who doesn't like this base and doesn't like him no alternative except to go to the other side. So as much as the Trump supporters hate the left and say they're so destructive, what I like to tell my friends, and they know I'm a moderate, there's no alternative. If you can't stomach Trump, I tell him, I said, listen, he's forcing it where it's either a guy like him or eventually someone like Bernie. And when they say that, they freak out. I said, so if Bernie becomes president, it's your guys' fault. And they listen to that. They listen to the Reagan argument, and they listen to the thing about ripping us apart and you're going to get the other extreme. And they don't know it, because no one's telling them that. They're hearing from Trump, they're hearing from social media, they're hearing the same echo chamber. So it's really a problematic, and the same on the left. And they don't want to compromise. God forbid there's little compromise. There's some compromise on these principles to have some type of consensus, like a Rooseveltian coalition or a Reagan coalition or some type of coalition with the center to hold it together to keep these, quite frankly, and my friends who like Trump don't want to hear it, to keep these frankly authoritarian tendencies at bay. But no one on either side wants to hear it. But I still think there's a broad group in the middle that's had it with both sides. I really do.
Well, didn't Reagan refer to that? The silent majority was
I think,
sort of
I
his
think it was
phrase?
even before him. I think even Nixon did that. But you know what? Nixon, I remember Nixon at the end of his resign. Nixon, I can't believe Nixon Trump has made Nixon look great in history. We would have been lucky to have Nixon instead of Trump. This guy does not understand the Constitution, doesn't understand the legal implications of what he's doing. And he doesn't care, and his followers are going to listen to him, and they don't want to hear anything else. And no other leader's done that, and this is what's dangerous. But but he doesn't, and he lost 2 popular votes. He lost the Electoral College this time, no matter what he says, and he's never been able to get any type of broad-based consensus, which is what you got to do in a democracy. It's not just about him and making his followers happy and getting his followers all excited. And I'm glad, as like I said, I'm glad you're happy. I'm glad you love him. But when he rips everything apart, and one day there's a president on what you consider the far left, don't get mad. Look in the mirror, man. Because you wouldn't compromise.
So then, what's an example, or who's someone you could see as a potential Rooseveltian leader today?
Well, I guess how it works is Roosevelt became Roosevelt because he came in at the right time. He had the skill set for that. Maybe another period of history, forgetting he was the right man at the right time for the communications medium at the time. Television wouldn't have worked for him at the time because he was disabled, but radio for that period, how people were, was perfect for him. So a lot of times, same with Lincoln, the times make the leader. Today, I wish Joe Biden, like a lot of people, I wish he was a little bit younger. But the good thing about Biden, what I do have to say about him, and you have to admit this about him, is that I never liked him. I always thought he was arrogant. I always thought he was kooky. When he wanted to be president, I thought he was like insufferable. I don't believe he ever thought he'd be president, and I think the only reason he ran was because of Trump. If Trump wasn't going to run again, and Marco Rubio was going to run again, or Marco Rubio was president, Biden would never run again. He was done. So I think he went forward out of service. So again, the age is a little bit of a concern, just because it's hard to tell, how much he's lost a step here and there. But you know what? There's also been wise elder leaders who've done very well at his age, and so far I think he's got it. And sometimes you need that wisdom. You need that lack of ambition. You don't get the sense that this guy, like every other president gets in, is already worried about his reelection. I don't think he gives a damn about getting reelected. He gives a damn about doing the job right now. Can he? I don't know. So I was kind of happy. I never liked him, but for the moment, for the times, I was glad he made it. Can he pull it off? I don't know. When Roosevelt took office, I'm sure it was pretty grim. Wasn't so sure he could pull it off. But right now, he's the guy. He's got the qualities. Again, I wish he was 4 years ago when he gave the speech at the Democratic National Convention when Clinton was nominated, he gave a great speech. So I feel like he has lost a step in the last few years, no question about it. But, let's hope he's still solid enough and strong enough mentally to do the job. But, yeah, I think he could maybe. And I know if anyone's listening to this who are Trump supporters, they're laughing. He's the worst president in history. Yeah, I know. Sure. Worst president in history has been in for 3 months, But hopefully those who are open-minded in the center will grasp onto him, and he will be able to hold the left, and they'll realize, listen, there's more things right now. You got to compromise to preserve a democracy.
What? Well, I agree with a lot of that. I did not vote for Joe Biden, although I'm cautiously optimistic. I'm
Are you talking about the primary or the general now?
In the general.
Okay.
I didn't vote a Republican either, but
Okay.
I don't subscribe to either party. I try and look at each election as an individual thing with an eye on the arc of history, and you do the best you can. why not a third party?
I think a third.
I mean,
party,
Ralph Nader was sort of this. People see him as like such a spoiler some years ago.
I'll tell you exactly why. There's a myth that this third party is going to solve it. Our system, our Constitution that was established, I guess, in 1787, is first of all wasn't even set up for two parties. They did not envision parties. They didn't envision factions. It is certainly not set up for a third party. In a parliamentary system with all its instabilities, a parliamentary system, you can get rid of a government like you saw in Israel just the other day. If a majority of the parliament doesn't want the government, they're out. It's majority rule. So yeah, you can have a bunch of parties. They can make coalitions. There's an inclusiveness to that. We've all seen in history there's an instability to that, which is not good. But at least in that system, you can have multiple parties. In our system, we are not set up for a third party. It's a myth. Because can you picture a presidential election with a third party that's thrown in, that no one gets a majority electoral college, that's thrown into the House of Representatives? And in the House of Representatives, each state gets one vote. And then the person becomes president who gets a majority of those votes. So
wait, let's deconstruct this. I want to make sure I'm following you.
In our country,
you have to have a majority.
You have to have a majority of the electoral college to become president.
And if it's split in three, that's nearly impossible, right?
Well, no. What I'm saying is, if you have a third party and that person gets enough electoral votes to deny you a majority, I forgot what this majority, like 270, 280, something like that. There's some number of the electoral college, and we can look it up online in a second. But I think it's like you need like 270 something electoral votes. So let's say there's, I don't know. Well, let's see. I think it's
476. Is that?
Wait, but it's 400. I think it's 535 electoral votes. I think it's the House versus the Senate, 535. So I don't know. Was that 260? Something like that. Let's say it was 250. Let's say there's 500 electoral college votes. You need 251 to get a majority. Let's round it off to make the math easy. A third party candidate comes in. They win 80 votes. Someone else wins 200 votes or 170. Someone else wins, I don't know, 160. In other words, they get below that majority. It has to be thrown in the House of Representatives. That's chaos.
That's what I'm getting at. So then how does it work there?
It goes in the House of Representatives. Each state has one vote. So I assume what happens, each congressional, so the New Jersey delegation, I don't know, let's say they have 16 Congress members now. Let's say they have 16 Congress members somehow. I don't know the process. I guess it's a vote of the Congress members. I guess they vote among themselves to be a unit vote towards the president.
I'm curious to know how this works.
Well, no, that's how it works. I'm pretty sure. I think it happened once. I think it happened with John Quincy Adams or something like that in the early 1800s. I think it happened. It would be chaos. It would be unbelievable. So there have been periods where it could have happened. It's interesting you said it. I read a lot of history, and I tend to read the 20th century history of the 1900s. I never read much of the Civil War, but for some reason, I've been drifting more towards it, reading a lot of memoirs. I'm not so much interested in the battles. I'm more interested in the politics because, it was so long ago. We forget that this country split up and there was a rebellion, and we kind of now are a little more aware of it because of what happened in January 6th of this country. And back then in the 1860 election, there were four major candidates: Abraham Lincoln with the New Republican Party. And there were two Democrats. There were the Northern Democrats of Stephen Douglas and the Southern Democrats of John Breckinridge, who were the slavery Democrats, and Douglas was the anti-slavery Democrats. There was a guy from the Constitutional Party named John Bell who got some electoral votes. And I was reading the memoirs of a prominent senator then, and he was afraid, and I never really thought about it, that no one would get an electoral majority. And on the eve of the Civil War, on the eve of the point where the country was about to rip itself apart, it would have been thrown in the House of Representatives, which would have been chaos. As it was, Lincoln was chaos because the South seceded once he got elected. They said, we're not staying around, and we know what happened. And that's what it took to end slavery, the original sin, which still plagues us to this day. But that was an example of chaos in the system. And there was chaos in the system after the Civil War, too, which is a whole other issue. But this third-party panacea, it doesn't work. Now, in other countries, forget the parliamentary system for a second. You see a lot of presidents in a lot of countries who are elected, and they have two rounds of voting. They have a first round, and if no one gets a majority of vote, they have a runoff. So you see that in France. You just saw that in Peru. These are non-parliamentary systems. These are presidential systems that often usually have a parliament with them too. And so think about that. That's fine. So like in France, last time there were four major candidates: Macron, who won, Le Pen, who seems to me a bit nutty, and there was a far left candidate and a fairly far right candidate. I can't pronounce their names. I can see their names in front of me, but I don't speak French. So they have a first round, and no one got 50%, and Macron and Le Pen had a runoff. They go against each other, and whoever gets the most votes wins. That's set up for a third party, if you want it. And that's what happens in these countries. You also will find that, a lot of times I write in the paper about nonpartisan elections. Let's bring it home. I write about Red Beck a lot in the paper that they should have nonpartisan elections like Asbury Park. They should probably have a strongly directly elected mayor. And I say you have to have runoffs. Same principle. If you have a system like they have in Jersey City, where you're having a nonpartisan system and everybody runs in one column for mayor, and we have it in Asbury Park now, and no one gets a majority, okay, the top two have a runoff and someone gets a mandate. In this country, there's no provision for that in the Constitution. So this third party thing that everyone thinks is a panacea is a disaster. The one silver lining of this two-party system that frustrates us so much is at least it provides some type of stability. Because you could see in certain places where everything falls apart in a parliamentary system. This usually forces us into two choices, forces us to stabilize, forces us to have coalitions early, and then put them forward as presidential candidates as well as candidates for our United States Congress. The problem, of course, like in every country, is when each party goes to their extreme, just like you have in parliaments, and that's always been a problem in this country. Because to win a nomination, you gotta play to the base, and that's a problem in Congress, and that's a problem in the Senate, and that's a problem in every state legislature too.
So what about abolishing the Electoral College? Would that not pave the way for the possibility for those other a third party or more ideas or more people or more choice to come through the pipeline?
Listen, you could have a constitutional amendment that says, hey, look, instead of electing the president by electoral college, we're going to have a national popular vote. And if someone doesn't get a majority, there'll be a runoff. But that would take a constitutional amendment, which I guess takes the ratification of 3/4 of the states, or else a constitutional convention, which is another story, which could become like a rogue runaway constitutional convention, do anything you want. But you need a constitutional amendment to do that.
Well, you're clearly an opinionated guy, so I'm sure you've thought about this. Is that something that you would support?
I just don't know if it would ever happen. I just don't think it's realistic for the country to make that happen. Given the way things are going, I'd support it. But you know what? Don't kid yourself. There's risks there too. Because, again, in any democracy, the problem that you have, and democracies are relatively new phenomenons in government, but certainly in the modern history, say from 1900 on, the biggest problems you have in democracy is when there's a political center that fails and the extremes rise, and that means there's a lack of compromise and a lack of ability for different sectors of society to come together and have some type of consensus. So even in an open presidential system like you get in other countries, you can have, the two nutty extremes manage to get to the final round, or one of the nutty extremes managing to get to the final round. Like, you could have a crazy, you could have something where you could have one crazy fascist of the right or crazy authoritarian on the left, and have a bunch of other candidates split the vote and have this man or woman get to the final round. And once someone's in the final round, all bets are off. You never know what's going to happen. And it depends who their opponent is, and you would hope a country would unite against them. Hitler took power through a parliamentary system. I don't know the exact figures, but I don't think the Nazi Party never got more than 40% of the vote in the Reichstag. But that was enough. They had a coalition, they took power, and that was it. Then they just took over from there. So yeah, I mean, this is a dangerous situation when there's no compromise, and it's not much you can do about it. I mean, I'm one voice. I think I know what I'm talking about from history. I am an opinionated guy, and my opinion to people is, well, you effing loosen up. You're not right 100% of the time, and the people you're listening to are not right 100% of the time. And until you agree that you got to compromise and give something up, this system doesn't work. And the result is always a reaction. It's always authoritarianism. Because we have chaos. People don't want to live in chaos. And they turn to an authoritarian. It happens every time.
I agree with that. Well, you've painted an interesting picture of a lot of runaway ambition and out of control ambition with politicians.
I'm sure, as I said, if there is a God, and God to say to you and I, like, Dan, I'm going to take you on a tour of the Roman Empire. It's going to take about an hour. I'm going to change your brains. You'll see the whole sweep of what happened. And I'll watch it. You'll see it in an hour, and you'll understand the whole thing. We would say, oh my God, I can't, this is exactly like, and it'd probably be everything we see here. Human nature hasn't changed that much.
I totally agree.
That's my theory.
So with all that runaway ambition and with leadership running in so many directions, what made you want to get involved with that personally? What was your ambition?
In terms of politics?
Yes. When you started to run, you said
when I was young. Well, I liked history when I was a teenager and even 12 or 13 years old. I liked it. And I was one of those young people who I liked the idea of running. And I read a lot of how people conduct their political careers, and I loved the idea of being in the state legislature in my 20s, like a lot of people did. I wanted to do it because I just thought it would be. I like politics. Back in my 20s when I was younger, I loved the competition of politics. I liked the challenge. I loved the policy stuff. And I thought it would just be a really interesting thing to do. And I could do some good, but I was politically ambitious, Now at 59, I would be handling a lot better I'd be handling it a lot, I think, better and differently than in my 20s. But, when I won a couple elections, people supported me partially because of what I was saying. I think partially because of the promise that I showed, just like when I will vote for a young person. But I did it out of interest, out of something interesting to do, something fulfilling to do, something where I thought I could make some differences, and ambition. And in the end of the day, though, I thought I was better than most of what I saw, quite frankly. I was willing to take more political risks. I lost a seat because of, I voted for some things I thought were right, and that cost me a seat in my career, which I don't mind, because as one person once told me, they said, listen, you should be voting for this, whether you win it, whether you end up losing or not, because that's what we sent you to do. Interestingly, when I look back what I voted for, it ended up some tax increases. I was very liberal back then, but not crazy left wing, but moderate liberal. Right back now, I probably would be voting differently, just because I think it could have been a bit different way, just in terms of what I've seen in life.
Well, we evolve as humans.
Yeah, but since then I had a business. Back then it was interesting. They elected me. I hadn't practiced law yet. I was still a law student. I'd worked for Frank Pallone as his aide when he was a state senator. I'd worked for his predecessor in Washington, a guy named Jim Howard, who was a congressman. I had been a reporter. So I had a limited life experience, but they voted for me based on my potential. But I had yet to actually practice law, where I saw a lot of things. I practiced different types of law, and I'd yet to actually run my own business, which also is an important thing to do, even if it's a small business like mine.
Yeah, no doubt. I was recently listening to an interview Robert Shear was doing with Dennis Kucinich, who was also one of the youngest mayors, maybe
Cleveland,
in American history.
Yeah.
Cleveland, that's right. It was a great interview. I'm a fan of Robert Shear. Talk about being up in years and still being effective.
Yeah.
I'm a fan of his work. Also, Berkeley, didn't he work with some papers at Berkeley as well? I'm
Don't know.
Not 100% sure.
Is it Robert Shear, or is that who it is? You're not talking about Robert Reich. Robert Shear.
Shear.
Okay.
No, not the former labor secretary.
I think later taught at Berkeley afterwards. Yeah.
Yeah, him as well. Yeah. No, Robert Shear, the reporter, the journalist, and he was interviewing Dennis Kucinich, and it was great. And one of his questions was like, "Okay, so when you got there, what were the big surprises? Like, where suddenly you're in the machine, to use a corny word, but it's a decent one. What surprised you, and then how did the machine put the brakes on some of your ideas? What did you see when you entered politics that put the brakes on your ideas?
Well, the big moment is when I got elected to the state legislature, the state assembly. I was 28. I was the youngest there. I'd gotten elected again to the council. I'd worked for Frank Pallone when he first started, who is just a terrific guy. He's a really nice person. What you see is what you get with him. He's no different than he was when he was 32.
Yeah, I met him once or twice. He seemed like a real dude.
You could disagree with him. You may disagree with him. You may agree with him over the years. Sometimes I've grown to disagree with him politically, but personally, he is exactly as he is. Actually, a lovely, lovely, nice guy. So I had worked with a bunch of different people. I'd seen a lot. Nothing surprised me, except when I got into the state legislature, and I got in there behind the scenes, and the Democrats had just gotten a majority. We just got a Democratic governor elected named Jim Florio. And I saw behind the scenes, we all talked about legislation, how to pass it, what to do. We all talked about the politics of it mostly. And the eye-opener for me, more than any extent that people realize, is the extent that elected officials want to get reelected, stay in power, is greater than you will ever know. And the reason I say that is, again, I don't care if it's Democrat, Republican. I don't care if it's a Trump type of guy. I don't care if it's a Bernie Sanders type of gal or man or woman. Those who are in there want to stay in there. They want to get reelected more than you would ever know. And you don't know because they're such great actors. And that, I go back to what I said earlier in this podcast, where, again, I was in the minor leagues in the state legislature. A lot of those people I was with went up to the Congress, became governors, became senators. And they're the best in the country, just like the best baseball players, you know what I mean? And they will listen, and strangely, most of them are very nice people, quite frankly. But what they do is, you can call it lying, you can call it leading, you can call it whatever you want. But they hide the extent. I mean, everyone knows they just want to get reelected. It is more than you even know. It's ridiculous. The point where, I can't remember what it was, but you have leaders of your party. There was a speaker of the state assembly who was a leader of the Democratic Party. And I remember that, sometimes I would want to vote against something that they really wanted, some special interest might have wanted. They'd be fighting with me, and we'd get in arguments. And what I finally did was, I forgot what it was. There's something I said, I'm just not voting for this. And instead of getting in a fight with the Democratic speaker and the leadership, I'll never forget, because I listened, I heard what was going on in other discussions. They'd come to me and they'd say, you got to vote for this. I'd say, it'll cost me my reelection. Oh, okay. And that would be it. That would be done. And part of it is the area I represented normally was a Republican legislative district. So we were a swing district. We kept, I was one of the votes that got the Democrats into the majority in the state assembly. So they didn't want to lose my district. So it occurred to me, I don't have to fight with these guys. I said, this will hurt me in my district. All right. Okay.
That's the great unifying for everybody gets it. They're like, oh, okay.
Well, if you're in a safe district, they don't want to hear it. But if you're in a safe district, you say this will. And again, it doesn't mean if you're Democrat primary. If you say to them, I can't vote for that. Let's say you're in a safe. It doesn't make a difference. A safe district for a Democrat or Republican. Your threat then, and this is important for people to understand, your threat to reelection is in a primary. So if you're in a Republican district, you're concerned about getting taken out today by a Trump MAGA Republican. If you're in a Democratic district, you're threatened by being taken out by an Our Revolution Bernie Democrat, left winger. So you're catering to them if you don't believe in them. So and unfortunately, you saw that to an extreme in Washington on January 6th in the aftermath with the Republicans, where they are afraid of the Trump voters. They cannot do anything to alienate them, to the danger of our country, in my opinion.
Here's what I don't understand.
So what I was about to say is, so the corollary to a swing district or a competitive district or a competitive state is to say, I can't vote for that. I'll lose in a primary. I can't alienate the Trump people. I can't alienate the Sanders people.
Here's what I can't understand, though. So as the country becomes more polarized, as media supports polarization because it's probably good for advertising.
That's exactly it. Listen, all those things, MSNBC, Fox News, at the end of the day, they're as craven as the politicians.
Yeah, no,
it's about ratings and money and fame.
100%.
Totally.
But what I don't understand is the average human that I come in contact with, either in my everyday life or in my close family life or when I'm just out and about, conversations like this, whatever, the average person is neither one of those things when you really run down certain issues.
That's my point. I think there's a broad middle.
So then we're
screwed. You're screwed by the extremes, and that's.
But why wouldn't a political party, either one or a third or whatever, work to prop up, promote, and push that person as a candidate?
Well, let's look at our system. A third party doesn't work because certainly in our presidential system, a third party doesn't work. It's a centrist party. Within the individual members of Congress and the House of Representatives or the United States Senate or the State Assembly or State Senate and state legislatures, the problem is that most of the let's talk about the House of Representatives. It's pretty much gerrymandered. Everyone knows what that is. Most seats are designed and drawn so one party.
Well, describe it. I don't think everybody knows.
Well, a gerrymander is that every state, the state legislature in every state is in charge of drawing the lines that set up a congressional district. And what gerrymandering is the lines are drawn to make sure the incumbents. Usually it's meant that the party that controls the state gerrymanders the districts to favor that party, so most of them get elected, and that's generally true. So what happens is most districts are going to go one way or the other. So what happens is because so few districts in state legislatures and the United States Congress are competitive, the only way they can lose is to lose to someone running against them for the party nomination, which is someone on the right or someone on the left. So all of those in the political center, of which right now because of Trump I'm left of center, other points I'm the right of center, but I'm definitely a centrist. So all of this generally in the political center, which I think let's say 45% of the country is, it doesn't make a difference because if you're challenging the primary, like AOC took out an establishment Democrat, okay, so she's on the rise, and in her district, it made some sense, quite frankly. But in other places, where it makes a little less sense, it's a little more moderate. If there's a threat from the left or a threat from the right, They're going to worry about that. And certainly in a presidential election, you get the nomination, you have to worry about it. Now, yeah, in a presidential system, we talked about with runoffs, you could have a centrist candidate, and sometimes they can win. I think Macron, who won in France, was a little bit right of center, so it kind of worked there. But generally in our country, it's hard. It's the extremes that guide it.
And you're saying that's more of a defensive move?
It's all about staying in office.
That's interesting.
Now, listen, in some places that are competitive in the general election, of course, they're making moves to stay in office there. But remember, people, once you get there, it's such a prestigious thing. It's such a hard-fought thing. The rest of our current civilization salutes it and makes it such a prestigious thing, as we've always done, as humans have always done, back to the Greek and Roman empires, no doubt, and even before that. And we unwittingly do that because it shouldn't be. When you think about it, we can't help it. That's how we get excited when we meet a leader. They get excited to get the adulation. So they want to stay. So they're going to do whatever it takes to stay. Fortunately, some within reason will hopefully not go all the way. But so, if most, again, in the United States Congress and in the U.S. Senate for that matter, right now, if you're a Republican senator, you can't alienate the Trump supporters. If you're an incumbent United States senator, you're going to get tossed. If you're trying to get the nomination, you get tossed. And similarly, quite frankly, if you're in many states that are Democratic, you alienate the left, you're going to get denied renomination. I mean, if Cory Booker were sitting at the Judiciary Committee for Amy Coney Barrett, and forgetting Kavanaugh's issues when he was a teenager about what happened there, because that's some serious issues there. But let's say it never happened, and it was Kavanaugh and Gorsuch and Barrett who were nominated, and they became Supreme Court justices. I hate to say it, but those are normal conservative justices for the Supreme Court. And you had a Republican president, you had a Republican Senate, and everyone knew what the United States Senate was about when they vote. They know that judges are a big part of it, and the country made a Republican Senate. So again, those were not crazy choices. Again, except for the Kavanaugh issue with the alleged rape, and maybe he should have been nominated for that. But taking that away, just talk about Gorsuch and Coney Barrett, for example. Those are normal judges. If Cory Booker said, you know what, I want to kind of make this back to a normal situation where judges, we can keep some independence for them, we can keep them out of politics. As far as I'm concerned, unless there's some real problem with their qualifications, unless there's some real problem with their ethics, like we used to do when they'd get approved 80-20, I'm going to vote for a judge who's qualified, and I'm going to have enough faith that they're going to go in there and do the right thing. Can you imagine? He'd be done. He'd be killed in the Democratic primary. And if a Republican tried that with a Democratic justice, like now, if Biden nominates
I can't imagine that.
They wouldn't do it. But you know what? But you're trying to tell me that with 50 Democrats. But here's the thing: 100 senators, all 100 don't agree with that. Bullshit. Of course, most of them agree with it. Because they shouldn't be doing it because you're politicizing the court. The last part you need to politicize, but you can't tell that to people now because people don't want to hear it. But the truth is, you had a Republican president, you had a Republican Senate. Everyone knew what that meant with the Supreme Court. If people didn't give a damn enough to vote for to get an elected Democratic senator, a Democratic president, you got to live with it. And these people, again, let's take Kavanaugh out. Maybe you could, let's say, what happened there. I forgot her name, but the woman who said that he raped her, assaulted her. She had a lot of credibility. And like let's say I was president and I heard that straight. Say, you know what, you got to be beyond reproach. You're gone, Kavanaugh. And you put someone else who was equivalent to Gorsuch or Coney Barrett. I mean, that's a Republican nominee. And you get pissed off when the Republicans don't vote for the equivalent Democratic nominees. And sure enough, they rejected Trump stuff when it came to the Supreme Court with the election. They did the right thing. But we've gotten away from that. And that's a problem because they can't tell the truth. They never really could. But you used to be able to have Supreme Court justices used to be, I mean, even as late as before Robert Bork in the 70s, the early 80s, they get appointed 80-20 or 90-10.
Was the general populace, from your understanding, paying less attention to those appointments?
Well, I think
it's so politicized.
Well,
now.
Our country's got more politicized because of communications and because of the rise of talk radio, the rise of cable television. Before it was networks and newspapers. In some ways, we had more peace. We didn't have to listen to it all the time, so they weren't as politicized. And there's a theory, and there's some. I believe there's something to it. The Supreme Court, in many ways, rightly so, took on more social issues and more divisive issues because they had to step in. And there's some commentators, you'll read some conservative commentators who say, you know what, when it comes to Roe v. Wade, maybe the Supreme Court shouldn't have been deciding this abortion. And they may even say, listen, I'm pro-choice, but you know what, it should have been decided by the elected officials in the legislatures. And you know what, Democrats, you put this in the Supreme Court, and don't be shocked that the Supreme Court is so politicized. That's their argument. I don't know if I agree with that. I certainly don't agree with the marriage equality. Marriage equality definitely belongs there. It's a matter of due process and it's a matter of equal protection. But so that the issues have become more contentious. Oh, and by the way, and both sides raise a ton of money off it too. Both sides, and not even the elected officials. All these different groups, all these different advocacy groups on the right and left. You get a Supreme Court justice battle. It's payday for them, and they're all kind of unofficial. It's like crazy. It's as I said, if you and I could travel back to the Roman Empire, I bet we'd see like, oh my God, this is like what we saw with this or what we saw with that. Nothing's changed.
Well, it's very obvious why you went on to publish a newspaper, sir. TriCity News. Why? I mean, of course, you cover more than 3 cities, but why this idea when you started the paper of TriCity? Is that like your personal interests lie in those cities?
No. What happened was I had a vision. Obviously, I have a lot of strong feelings about history and politics nationally, locally, and state, as you can tell. And I have a lot of strong feelings about making this area into a vibrant place culturally, and just as strong and just as passionately. It's just a different subject. The basis of this is, so I went out to UC Berkeley for my undergraduate degree, and I'd never been out there before, but I grew up here in Ocean Township. I spent a lot of time in Asbury Park in my teenage years. I thought it was very cool, obviously. To me, a city was Manhattan, which I never really liked, to be honest with you. I thought it was kind of dirty, and I didn't like it. So I go out to California, I go out to San Francisco, the East Bay, Berkeley, Oakland. I'm like, oh my God, this is like one big Asbury Park, certain sections of it. It's like all these cool craftsman houses. It's like kind of, you can drive around. It's spectacular. It's beautiful. It's water. It's ocean. It's culturally vibrant. It's like, this is great, And there's all these little interesting neighborhoods and towns linked by water. So I came back. It's a long story how I came back, but I eventually came back to work in politics. I thought I would have ended up out there, but because I had opportunities to come back. So I came back and I started to look at our area where I grew up, Eastern Monmouth. I was like, God, I just kind of like fantasized as like one big Bay Area. And I read about this all the time. And I really did. And I always kind of thought about it like, like when you're up in Atlantic Highlands, you're up in Scenic Drive, you're looking out at New York, see the Verrazano Narrow Bridge. It reminds me of being in the East Bay in the hills, looking out the Golden Gate Bridge. Again, all these little cool little places linked by water, these little wacky little urban areas of Asbury and Long Branch and Red Bank. And I always thought of it like in my mind, a little fancy, like a little Bay Area. So when I started the paper, it was more, that was the vision. And it is to this day, and I write about it for the last 22 years, is to make this Tri-City region of Eastern Monmouth, this vibrant suburban area like no other. Place as vibrant and happening as any happening city. In the East Bay, the San Francisco Bay Area is a big inspiration for that. Because, out there's interesting places in Berkeley. There's interesting places in a town called Albany, north of Berkeley. There's places in Marin. There's places south of San Francisco. There's places in San Francisco. There's places in Oakland. There's a lot of natural beauty. There's urban areas. And it's a great, vibrant place. So I wanted, what the paper to do is, because I wanted to live in an interesting place, I wanted the paper to shape our area in that vision. And I think, the first part of that is bringing Asbury Park back to its rightful place as this, cultural, artistic engine for the region. And
describe Asbury Park when you started the paper. It might not resemble exactly what's going on right now.
Asbury Park in 1999, the 90s I think were the worst time in Asbury Park, where it was in the worst shape economically. It had been most depopulated. There was a lot of crime. There was a lot of despair. But what was interesting about Asbury and growing up here and then representing it in the state legislature, knowing a lot of people here, I knew most every nook and cranny of it. So you had these places, no one was around. You had these great old buildings that either were vacant or there'd be like a person living in it or they'd have some interesting office, And I'd go and I know all the spaces now that have been redeveloped, all the downtown, all along the Main Street corridor. I've been in all of them, in the 1990s and saw them in original states, and it was so cool. I mean, as I like to say, I loved Asbury in 1995. I loved it in 2005. I loved it in 2015. I'll probably love it in 2025. It's always been interesting. So back then it was pretty much depopulated. But when I started the paper in 1999, there was a lot more interesting things going on here than people realized. There was a vibrant LGBT community. There were artists here. Some were living on Cookman Avenue that no one had any idea. was just a lot of interesting stuff going on. It was multicultural, it was diverse. And, I used to trash the Asbury Park press a lot in the beginning. Now I don't, because they're kind of defanged and they really have no power. But, back then they would play this, they were bigger, they were more powerful. They would play to their, just like politicians, they would play to their readers, which was overwhelmingly from the suburbs. They play to them about the worst, not just racial prejudices, which they definitely did in terms of just the way they covered the city, but just their prejudices against Asbury Park. And, I used to hear it all the time. Some people still say, pave the place over. You go to Asbury Park, it's like you're going to come out alive. There's still people who actually have the nerve to say, and some would say it in front of me, and I kind of like tell them off, just pave over and bomb the West Side. I mean, they really, you still hear shit like that from people. Not as much as you used to. Obviously, it pisses me, it still pisses me off to this day. And so, in the early days of the paper, I was very combative against the suburbs where I came from because I knew how they think. I called them ignorant suburbanites. I called the Asbury Park press the biggest factor that held Asbury Park back. It's going to be people from outside the area who aren't prejudiced against our city who's going to bring it back. And I thought, this paper would be the voice for it. So there was interesting devices I purposely used back then, starting from the very first issue in January 1999. Our office had been in the building that Pascal and Sabine is now, on the ground floor of the New Jersey Natural Gas building. After the pandemic, we went virtual. I run out of my house. Everyone's in their house. But I had that office for about 20 years. We're in downtown Asbury. It was a ghost town. I used to write, I'd say, listen, from here in downtown Asbury, we think this. In Asbury, we think this. I would say, up in Red Bank, this is going on. In other words, I made Asbury the center of everything. And that was on purpose. And I took shots at as much as I could at the press and everybody around here, got them riled up to the point where I had people saying, listen, I'm a good suburbanite. I'm a good person. I like Asbury Park. And meanwhile, people like, say, from New York who would come down and read the paper and say, wow, this is really cool. There's interesting stuff going on here. And sure enough, people from outside help bring it back. Doesn't mean there's not challenges today. Doesn't mean there's not problems here today. Because there's obvious problems and challenges anytime a city, quote unquote, comes back. And that could be a whole nother podcast.
As I could attest to what you're saying about Asbury in the 90s. That's when I was renting space in Asbury.
Yeah.
And it was super rough.
Yep.
And you had to really watch your back. However, it was an amazing creative community.
Wasn't it?
And
people had no idea. People had no idea.
Some of those spots now that are like probably the primest of the prime, they were being rented by artists, sculptors, metallurgists. And these were my friends, and we would just like play late night shows, after hours parties. It was great.
It was glorious.
It was glorious. Now you better make sure you got something on you just in case shit gets crazy.
You had to be careful. But generally, it was a lot safer than people thought. I bought my house in 1994 on Deal Lake Drive. It's a beautiful Art Deco townhouse, beautiful ocean lake views. I live there till this day, to today. I got it for nothing. And it was interesting. I came from Ocean Township, and I have to say, there were two different reactions when I told people I bought it. I was about 32 then. Some were, are you out of your mind? And others were, oh, that's a really great area. I love that place. So it was weird. It was even split then. But I just remember the derogatory comments from so many people, quite frankly, white people, about the city that really, to this day, rankles me. And you'll hear it every so often. But, of course, now they're the ones who come in, and that's fine.
You're right. I've heard it my whole life.
Yeah,
you get that person who leans in, looks to the side, like suddenly we're on the same team, and they're like, you know what we should do, and you're like, oh fuck, here it comes.
Well,
drum roll.
Yeah,
I don't know.
When they say it to me, they got to be careful because I usually am pretty strong coming back.
It's
but I heard it, I understood it. It was real. People here of color who talk about prejudice outside, it's real. It may not be it's not always as vicious as they think, but the fact that someone would say it and think it and say stuff about Asbury, pave it over, bomb it, it's that in itself is vicious. And it's just, it was ugly. So that changed. But again, today now we have other problems related to these issues of success, which are about obviously housing affordability and things like that. That's the big challenge now.
We've had a guest or two on the show talk about affordable housing in Asbury. I understand some legislation was recently passed, pretty landmark legislation for affordable housing in the city. Is that correct?
A couple of things happened in the city with affordable housing. There was a nice consensus. I love the council. I think I've seen a lot of politics. I've seen a lot of politicians, and I think this council, and 2/3 of the citizens agree with me, 1/3 don't because they win 2-1, are excellent. I mean, you talk about people who don't worry about getting reelected. They are not obsessed with political careers. First of all, 4 of the 5 are retired, pretty much, although they still work. But Amy Quinn's in her mid-40s and in her prime, and she's excellent. And the others they're just really great. They're not looking to run for any of their offices. They're moderate people. They're reasonable. For a city, again, I don't always agree with all the progressive agenda, but for here I do. It's a progressive city. I want a progressive city council. We all do. And they're practical, progressive, mature people. So I think they do great. Now, there's others who disagree who want more action. Everyone's entitled to their opinions. Some of them I respect, I think are great. Some of them I think are utterly full of shit. But some are terrific. And some very good people were able to work out a few things with the council, such as an affordable housing ordinance that required set aside in new developments outside of the waterfront zone, because legally you can't. There's an agreement there. You can't just change the agreement without the consent of the developers. But
sure,
new development of a certain amount has to have like a 20% set aside of low and moderate income
something
housing.
like that. Yes.
And then, of course, recently there was the big issue with the rent control in Asbury Park, and that in the end went pretty much the right way, but it could have been much better, unfortunately, because of quite frankly, the intransigence and ridiculousness of some people. What happened was the Affordable Housing Coalition got enough signatures on the petition to put a very extreme rent control measure on the ballot, and I saluted them for doing that, because they suddenly, listen, the council is busy as hell. They've been looking into it. They've been doing rent control studies. They probably would have acted on it next year. But look, this had enough to get on the ballot. It forces the council by law to consider it or pass their own resolution. So I saluted this group for bringing the council to take action and deal with it and get some type of rent control. The group itself were split. Nothing personal from a personal level. I mean, personally, I like them all. Some of them I think are just out of control personally. They've lost election after election because they don't care. They're extreme. They don't listen to other people. They don't want to compromise. On the other hand, a few people in that coalition were excellent, and I can name them. Tracy Rogers, who I thought was a great advocate. Derek Minnow Bloom, I thought was a great advocate. And I'm particularly friendly with Derek and Tracy. I've gotten to know and like them a lot. And so they put forward this ordinance. It was very, very strict. It was too strict. It was unworkable. So the council passed their own ordinance. And then the sides wouldn't compromise. They tried to compromise. They couldn't get to a compromise. They really did try. But there was a lot of miscommunication, I think, on the petition side. I think there were elements there that would never have compromised anyway. So in the end, you went to the referendum. And what the referendum was about, a no vote was to support the council's resolution. A yes vote was to support this coalition's rent control, which I thought was excellent getting on the table, but in the end, too extreme. And I supported the council's rent control, and it passed. Like the council usually wins by 2-1 because people trust them. I thought, and it was more appropriate than the other one. And now you have some rent control. Theirs wasn't perfect. If the two groups had been able to sit down, and I think we could have gotten it a little tighter, and I think which would have helped renters more without causing other serious side effects. So in the end, we got some rent control, but it could have been better. So it was divisive. It was unnecessary. It should have been resolved. But but that's an issue that at least is being addressed, and they can always change it too.
Derek was on the show.
Yeah, he's terrific.
He's a cool guy. I met him through a mutual friend, and it's just something someone that's stuck in my mind. We both had a Noam Chomsky story,
sure.
So I felt like we had some spiritual
connection. He and I have a connection. We start talking about the Spanish Civil War, which was also a cataclysmic event.
Oh, good
for
Lord.
Democracies, and so we're so into it. We started our own Spanish Civil War book club at the Asbury Book Cooperative, where his wife Liza is the manager, and then it ended up we had a few other people join it. So that was kind of fun. We have a ton of things to talk about. But he was one of the people who was on the petition side. I think he's terrific. I think he's radical, but he's practical and he's reasonable. And he's fine. There's no personality. There's no ego involved, and he was great. And Tracy Rogers, who I actually had been at odds with in other political campaigns, I got to know through this, and I thought he was an excellent advocate. And if it was those two guys, and somebody else I'm not going to say my name, who I really think did not conduct themselves well. Others did conduct themselves well too. I'm not saying everybody on that side did conduct themselves well, but if it had just been Tracy and Derek, and maybe Amy Quinn and John Moore and me as the mediator in the room, I think we would have been able to do a compromise that would have been solid and everyone would have felt equally good and equally bad, which is a good compromise. So that's how I felt about that.
What do you have some advice for folks out there who want to get politically involved? either on a larger scale, major league scale, or on the Asbury Park level. Maybe they look around the community, there's things they love about it and they want to preserve. Maybe they look around the community and there's things they do not like and they want to affect change. What advice would you give someone? Because it's definitely an intimidating prospect to think about politics. I mean, just listen to everything you've been talking about. It's like, this isn't like clean,
there's a few things. There's a
wall,
few things. There's a few things. Generally, I think, humans are flawed. We're flawed beings. If you're a religious person, I don't really know religious doctrines well, but they'll talk about, I guess, whatever it is that we have it as that, that we have to always atone for or whatever. And, there's some truth to that. So humans are flawed, so remember that. But, at the local level, I find most people are well-intentioned. And even the people I just referred to in Asbury Park, who I don't like the way they conducted themselves in rent control, I know a lot of them personally. I think they are well-intentioned people. I think they get a little out of control, and I think they do damage to their own cause and the cause of the city and divide it by their actions. They're still good people. Now, I bring that up because it's easy to get involved at the local level. You just, if there's a campaign, if there's a candidate you like, you just reach out to them, say how I can get involved. You can knock on doors for them. You can make calls for them or her. If there's an issue that's important to you, it's easy now with social media. You can start a Facebook page, or you can find out a group that's advocating for it and join them. What I ask people to do, if they've listened to this long through the podcast, I do ask people to have some amount of, how can I put it? Not skepticism with cynicism, but a healthy skepticism to not always, when they encounter a politician who's telling them everything they want to hear, just be a little skeptical about it. It doesn't mean you can't follow him. Doesn't mean you can't support him. If there's a choice, listen, I obviously don't like Donald Trump. Some people do. If there's a politician who's telling me everything I want to hear and I'm a little skeptical and he's running against Donald Trump, I'm voting for him. That's the way it goes. Because I understand they got to get elected. They got to do what they have to do. Part of it's the act to get consensus. But don't believe everything you hear. And don't believe everyone is saying everything they think. Realize you have to compromise. And in the spirit of everything I said, I think the takeaway from what I've learned now as I'm approaching 60, from everything I've seen and read about, whether it's international history and politics or down here at the local level, you have to have some notion of compromise in a democracy. You have to have some notion that you got to give a little. You have to have some notion that you're not 100% correct. You have to have some sense of how to understand where the other side is coming from. And that's the advice I'd give people if you're going to get involved in it and go in it with that. And when you do that, you're usually more successful. And we're all more successful.
I think that's good life advice.
Well, that's good life advice, too.
Ask a lot of questions and be empathetic.
Be empathetic, be respectful, be open, be direct. There's never a stupid question. There's never anything to be embarrassed about. But be respectful, be open, be respectful, be empathetic. In the end, you know what? No one's asking you to compromise core moral beliefs. But ask if they're ask what you really can compromise without compromising core moral belief. And I think if people really thought about it, we could be a lot more flexible on all sides. And I think we'd have less of a threat here than we're facing in this country.
I think that's a good place to leave it, folks. If you have not, I don't know how you'd have to be not paying attention.
Yeah,
for
you'd be
many,
surprised
many,
by
many
people.
years.
A lot of people don't know, which doesn't surprise me. Yeah.
Well, you can't be too popular. We don't want that. You got to be a little edgy.
Yeah.
TriCity News, I see it everywhere. I'm sure you do too. Pick it up. And good advice from Dan Jacobson. Healthy skepticism. Ask a lot of questions. Be empathetic. And I think we'd all move towards a better place. Dan, thanks so much for coming on the show.
Pleasure.
All right, y'all. Bye.